Okay, so I think we're live. I'm just gonna check very quickly. Yes, so we are live. Okay. I think we're good to start. So, hi everyone, and welcome to our behind the scene. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for watching this presentation. If you're watching it on YouTube, just a reminder that this presentation will be recorded and that you can find it on our YouTube channel. We are live from Ottawa, and we would like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. So thank you again for joining us for our behind the scene workshop. Behind the scene is our monthly educational and bilingual workshop and presentation program. We alternate between French and English to offer educational and awareness raising workshops and presentations. Feel free to ask your questions in the chat, and we will be happy to answer them after the presentation. We are here today with Dr. Alan Martino. Thank you for presenting today. Dr. Alan Martino uses he, him pronouns. Dr. Alan Martino is a faculty member in the Community Rehabilitation and Disability Studies program in the Department of Community Health Sciences, Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. His main research interests are in critical disability studies, gender and sexualities, feminist and critical disability studies theories, qualitative and community-based research, particularly participatory and inclusive research methodologies. His work has been published in multiple journals, including Disability Studies Quarterly, Canadian Disability Studies Journal and Culture, Health and Sexuality, as well as edited volumes focused on disability and or sexualities studies. For our behind the scene workshop today, we will be talking about how the intersection of disability and sexuality remains a taboo topic. People labeled with intellectual disabilities are commonly de-sexualized and infantilized in ways that deny their sexual interests, desires, and rights. At times, disabled people are given misinformation about sexual health, which discourages them from exploring their sexuality. A drawing on qualitative interviews with adults labeled with intellectual disabilities. Dr. Martino will discuss the most common barriers that disabled people face when it comes to learning about sexual health and forming intimate relationships, as well as their strategies to be sexual. His presentation will also highlight how ableist and heteronormative assumptions that disabled people cannot identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, and queer have hidden the rich array of sexualities in this social group. Dr. Martino, you can start whenever you're ready, and thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for inviting me to present today. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's a great way to give back to Max Ottawa. Max Ottawa has done a lot for me in the past as well. So as a community member of Ottawa in the past. So thank you for this opportunity. Okay, so I'm actually located in Calgary now, but I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and to note that the city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Also, an accessibility note here. Please feel invited to use your space, whatever you are, in whatever way is accessible to you. For example, you may want to move around, stand up, lie down, put your feet up, go out, come back in, engage with another being. It can be your dog, your cat, your partner, tweet, take notes, or any other use of space that feels right to you. The plan for today is threefold. First of all, I want to acknowledge some of the history that we have here in Canada of eugenics, to also introduce the concept of Newgenics that help us understand some of the current experiences of people with lived experiences in the communities today. Then I'll share some research findings using some quotes from interviews with people with intellectual disabilities. And then I'll conclude by talking about some of the implications for intimate citizenship, and I'll tell you what that is. First of all, the intersection of disability and sexuality continues to be a taboo topic. There's still a lot of silence and hesitation about touching this topic. For example, in the past, I had organizations, service providers, who hang up on me as soon as I use the word sexuality in our conversation, or some organizations that said that there are more important issues than sexuality and intimacy. But now, thankfully, in the last few years, I've been seeing more and more service providers and community organizations that want to do better in this area. So I do see positive signs coming out as well. In our social world, people labeled with intellectual disabilities tend to face true controlling images or stereotypes. On one hand, they're de-sexualized, they're deemed to be childlike, innocent, right? A lot of people sometimes think they have no sexual desires or ways that they desire intimacy, love, affection. And on the other end of this spectrum is this notion that people with intellectual disabilities have, in quotes, excessive or dangerous sexualities, that they cannot control their desires, and that because of that, that those desires and their sexualities should be surveilled, controlled. No matter where people end up in these two ends of the spectrum here, what I see very often is that people experience very high levels of barriers and surveillance in their everyday lives. Of course, it is extremely important to understand vulnerability and risks. And when we look at the statistics, indeed, they show that people with intellectual disabilities are more likely to experience forms of abuse in their everyday lives in comparison with non-disabled people. At the same time, it's also important to think about ways that we can protect people, but not silence them. Sometimes what I've also seen is that overprotectionism can silence people with disabilities, even when done in good intention. We need to make sure that we're hearing from people with lived experiences rather than only hearing from support workers, family members, and other social actors in disabled people's lives. So in my work, I've been very passionate and committed to centering the voices of disabled people, making space for them to share their experiences on their own behalf. And just a quick note about language. You notice in my presentation that I use both terminologies, persons or people with intellectual disabilities, as well as disabled people. And this is in respect to different perspectives within disability studies and disability activism. So I go between the two terms. Some of the data that I'll be showing in this presentation, especially the interview data, comes from this research project titled The Romantic and Sexual Lives of Adults with Intellectual Disabilities in Ontario, Canada. For this project, I was able to do 46 semi-structured interviews with 33 men and 13 women, ages ranging from 23 to 64 years of age. But before I tell you a little bit of the current experience of my participants, I would like to just make sure that we are all on the same page in terms of the legacy, the historical background that we have here in our country. We have an eugenics history, right? Eugenicists, in essence, claimed the social problems, including poverty, were generically inherited. And what they advised for as a solution, in quotes, was that marriage regulation and what they called selective breeding. It was really this notion that racial betterment, right, or that we can improve the human race by manipulating and controlling what social groups would be able or should be able to reproduce while making sure that others didn't. In our history here in Canada, we have a history of what has been called negative eugenics. Negative eugenics means putting into practice multiple policies, practices that prevent people from having children, and that included, for example, forced sterilization. We have Indigenous peoples, we have people with disabilities, certain immigrant populations who experience forced sterilization here in Canada. Here's a poster from the American Eugenics Society, and it's interesting as a historical kind of document. And you can see on the poster on the left, it says unfit human traits such as feeble-mindedness, epilepsy, criminality, insanity, alcoholism, pauperism, and many others run in families and are inherited in exactly the same way as color in guinea pigs. If all marriages were eugenic, we could breed out most of this whiteness or unfitness in 3 generations. This notion that social problems, rather than being caused by structural issues and structural inequality, were simply in people's bodies. And this notion that if we engage in marriage regulation, forced sterilization, that we could avoid certain social groups to reproduce while encouraging others to reproduce. On the right side, on the poster, you can see it says you can improve your education and even change your development or environment, but you really are, in capital letter, was all settled by your parents when you're born. Again, that notion that no matter what you do to change your circumstance, there's something inherited in your body that makes you more likely to be unfitted. The place where I'm located right now, Alberta, was actually one of the provinces that were the most prolific in engaging in some of those practices. So, for example, Alberta was responsible for 90% of more than 2,800 cases of involuntary sterilization of marginalized peoples in Canada between 1928 and 1972 under the Sexual Sterilization Act. This included, of course, people with disabilities and Indigenous peoples. What is interesting is that this wasn't a hidden practice. We're talking about a policy and boards making the decisions about whether someone should be sterilized or not, and we have notes from these meetings. So it wasn't a hidden practice at all. So this act allowed for the sterilization without consent of those who had an IQ registered below 70 or who were deemed to be in a psychotic state. Now, please note too the dates, right? 1972 may seem like a very far away date, but it really isn't if you think about it. We still have people in our communities who have experienced the results of these policies. Now, some people might say this policy ended in the 1970s. We learned our lesson. Unfortunately, when we look at the on-the-ground experiences of people labeled with intellectual disabilities today, we continue to see eugenics is still taking practice. It's still happening in our community on an everyday basis. What we also suggest is that there is another way to understand what is happening in the present. So there's a great concept to understand how eugenics looks like in the present, and that's Newgenics. Newgenics, as this quote from a website called Eugenics, says, quote, moves beyond biological and medical interventions to encompass systematic barriers to education, services, policies, and supports for disabled people in terms of sexuality and reproduction. What makes Eugenics very particularly scary and dangerous, in my opinion, is that it works more covert ways in comparison with the past eugenic practices and policies, right? They were much more blatant. Now, sometimes I see eugenic practices happening in more almost benevolent lens, like this notion that we should put people on birth control, whether or not they know about it or desire it or participate in the decision-making, simply because it's good for them. So sometimes it's sold in this lens that it's just good for people with disabilities. But also it happens in very systematic barriers. And I'll give you some examples to illustrate what I mean by Newgenics. In essence, the idea is that we're still preventing people with disabilities from reproducing, having sexual lives, learning about their bodies, getting evidence-based information. So let me give you some examples of neogenic practices that I've encountered in my own work. One of the key barriers that I found is infantilization. Let me make it very clear. All my participants were adults, so people over the age of 18 who are their own guardians and supposedly should be able to make decisions about their everyday lives and their intimate lives. But what I saw here is that sometimes people are treated as children. For example, Matthew, 39 years old, talked to me in his interview that he was not ready for intimate relationships. When I asked about, why is it that he felt he's not ready, that's when he says, my mother told I'm not ready. What we see here is that the decision that, or the assessment that he's not ready for intimate relationships despite his age, is that it comes from someone else's assessment, not his own. When I ask him to continue to explain a little bit more why that might be the case, that's when he says, I have too much homework, too much. I mean, telling someone that they have too much work and homework and that they should prioritize that, it's usually something that we tell teenagers or children in our society. And we know that in our society, people tend to become sexually active at a much earlier age, right, than 39 years old. Even forms of pleasure and things that he could do by himself, like watch pornography, was out of options for him. So Matthew, for example, talks about watching pornography or not being able to watch pornography, actually. He says that his mother said, when I get a bit older, like 50, he can then watch pornography. My mom told me I need to be older to watch that. So one of the two things that we see here is that we get this idea that their sexuality is being postponed. He should be able to have a relationship and watch pornography only when he's older, in his 50s. And he wasn't alone. I spoke with other participants who shared the same kind of message they learned by other people in their lives, that they should wait until their 40s, 50s, and 60s sometimes to even then consider to have a romantic relationship. That's a much later age than most non-disabled people in our communities. I've also encountered moments where people got misinformation. There is in the literature evidence that sometimes people with intellectual disabilities are given misinformation, either purposely or not purposely, to avoid or postpone intimate relationships and sexual expression. This was the case with Thomas when he kind of changes the script during the interview and asks me a question. That's when he asked me, so you have to be 36 to get married? That's the information he had received from people in his life. When I tell him that no, you can actually get married at an earlier age, even 16 sometimes, depending on the province. That's when he says, okay, so if you're 18, you can get married. Okay, because no one ever tell me about that, he says. Again, Thomas is a 36 years old man who never had an intimate relationship before, and he was given misinformation about his right to get married if he so desires. It was also evident to me that the only kind of limited sex education that people experienced, and to be clear, only half of my participants even received sex education. Other half did not receive sex education. Sometimes they were immediately or automatically removed from sex education classes on the assumption that they shouldn't or don't need to get that kind of information. But David was one example of someone who did get some sex information, but look at the limited aspect of it. He says, well, we talked about the different parts of the male and the female, about STDs and what STIs, what transmitted diseases is. I think we talked about everything, what sexuality is all about. Now, we all know in this room that sexuality is not just about STIs and body parts. Sexuality is also about intimacy, learning about your sexual gender identity. It's about having opportunities to go out there, meet people, make mistakes once in a while, right? It's much more than that. So it really stood out to me that for David, that becomes what sexuality is all about in his own words. Not only that, many times I've encountered people who got really discouraged or really scared by the information they got. This is so well illustrated by Randy, who said, sometimes they make it scary. This is inappropriate. this is wrong, or this is illegal, or this is dangerous. This isn't fun anymore. I don't want to do it, have sex. It's not going to be any good. I mean, if we put ourselves in his position, where the only kind of information that we learn about sexuality is always about danger and inappropriate behavior and getting into trouble, why would you bother wanting to be or experience sexuality and sex in any way if it only lands you into trouble? The other thing, too, that I found very common was the ways in which people are learning about sexuality, very infantilizing and inaccessible ways. For example, James, 34 years old, tells me about the kind of learning that he did about sexuality. He says, I did a course in my school. I did. I know birds and the bees, how to make the baby, stuff like that. I mean, birds and the bees, it's usually something that we tell children, right? When we want to avoid having that sex conversation, we talk about the birds and the bees and those other euphemisms for sex. Not only that, in his lessons about what he learned in terms of being a good man, as he said, he articulates his relationship with his girlfriend, someone who also has an intellectual disability. And that's what he says: no touch. I never touch her. My girl would never too. I ask her to stop. I put my hand up like this. I say, excuse me. I says, stop right there. It's interesting to me is that despite having being in a relationship for almost 10 years with his girlfriend, the lessons that he learned is that it's completely inappropriate to ever touch your girlfriend. Again, this is something that doesn't usually happen in normative kind of relationships between non-disabled partners. We kind of assume that sometimes there might be some level of intimacy, right, in these relationships. So sometimes people are getting this information that, again, makes sure that people are not being sexual, that they're not experiencing intimacy, or much less, having any opportunity to have a family or have children if that's what they want. Allison, 38 years old, learned a very similar lesson. When she talks about her relationship with her partner who also has an intellectual disability, she says, always distance from each other. I'm okay if he's beside me, but not that close. Again, we see this notion that we need to keep distance from each other, even when in intimate relationships. I spoke with partners who cannot see each other or call each other after 7 p.m., for example, because their family members might not be happy with that. There is quite a bit of control, surveillance, and limitations in terms of how people are learning about sexuality, but also what they can do even when they are in relationships. The bad level of information that people are getting, so focused on negative aspects of sexuality and not very helpful and accessible, makes people feel like they just don't know how to start or where or how to get a feel for the game, as some people have said, in terms of how to pursue intimate relationships. For non-disabled people, it might seem easy to figure out where to go, how to pursue relationships in those spaces, but that is not the case for everyone. So we shouldn't take that for granted. And that's the case with two participants, Iago and Andrew, who say, where do I start? I don't even know how to start looking. For example, one of my participants told me that he really wants to be in an intimate relationship and that he asked for advice from a support worker about how to do that. The only advice that he got was, quote, just go out more. I mean, that doesn't help, right? Like, that is not a kind of support that really allows people to thrive and be able to experience intimate relationships in a safe way and satisfying way in the community. I also got examples of people who had inaccessible information. One young man with an intellectual disability was extremely confused about why this banana was a part of this lecture about sexuality that he was participating in. Again, for non-disabled people, making that connection between banana and penis might seem very straightforward, but some other folks might not process information in the same way. So showing a banana and showing a condom may not be the most interesting or effective way of giving information. So it doesn't mean that people with intellectual disabilities do not find ways to be romantic and sexual despite all just challenges. So one way that I found people still crossing and finding ways around it is to keep their relationships and sexual lives a secret. Chelsea is a great example of this. And just to give you some context for this particular quote, at first, her support worker was sitting with us in the room, listening to the interview and just providing basic supports to Chelsea. And then the phone rings, the support worker leaves, and as soon as the support worker is out of the room, that's when Chelsea whispers very quickly to me, "We're not having sex, but just because we're in love. But don't tell Linda, the support worker, that. Nobody knows about me and him. It's a secret. Don't tell Linda. Promise me you won't tell Linda? He's my boyfriend, and I don't want anybody to know. You won't tell nobody?" The fear of getting into trouble, getting punished, which indeed some participants did get in trouble and experience forms of punishment, really encouraged some people to keep their relationships and sexual pursuits a secret. And sometimes that placed people into dangerous positions also. For example, I spoke with two men whose only private space that they have is public parks. They have living housing arrangements that they have no privacy, no locks on their doors. They are not allowed to have guests or overnight people. So the only kind of private space they have is to go to public parks where finally they're able to engage in sex and sexual encounters. So we are really putting people sometimes into vulnerable positions where they may land into trouble with policing services because of the lack of privacy and supports that we give to people. And it's important to note living arrangements is so key, right? What I've seen over and over again is people living with very limited privacy. They sometimes have support workers come in and out of their rooms without any announcement, living in small rooms, always with single beds. It's extremely rare to see people in the community who have double beds or beds that would allow for more than one person to be there comfortably. Some people are not allowed to have door locks. Some people are not allowed to have pornography, even in their own bedroom, in their private space. And some people even had curfews. I remember talking to one participant who's an adult and his legal guardian, but who had experience living in a particular setting, group home, where he had a curfew. He had to be back by 9 p.m. Now, I'm sure if I were able to see your faces in this room today, we all know that the fun usually starts after 9 p.m., right? Usually at 9 p.m., we're getting ready to go out. I mean, who goes to clubbing, for example, in queer spaces around 9 p.m.? Not many of us. So that really curtails opportunities for this young man to be out in the community and have the sexual and intimate encounters that he desires as an adult. The other thing that I want to give you as an example here of Newgenics, so there are very interesting range of practices, right? So there's this kind of more subtle practices where we give misinformation or we just don't give information about sexuality, where we kind of scare people out of desires to be in relationships. Is more subtle. But we also have more extreme examples of eugenics, and that's what I want to illustrate to you as well. So, for example, William, 32 years old, he managed to get married to someone with an intellectual disability, and that's when he shares his story. When I got married, the support worker said, "So, we need to get you to the health unit and all that, because, oh, you can't have children. You don't know how to take, you're not capable of that." I mean, to contextualize this a little bit further, that's the response from a support worker as soon as William announced that he got married. And for most non-disabled people, when someone says that they just got married, the response is a positive one, right? We say, "Congratulations, we're so happy for you." Isn't it interesting that here, the first response is, "Let's make sure that you're on birth control so you do not have children." So one could say that this is one example of Newgenics, right? This practice from the past that continues in the present, that in which we discourage people with disabilities from being intimate and having children. He continues, he says, "We wanted children. I mean, everybody wants children. I mean, you might have a bit of a tougher time supporting it, but there is family, friends, people who will support you. I honestly think that there really is a lot of drawbacks for people with disabilities. People think, oh, you can have children. So here, what really stood out to me was this notion that for him, family doesn't need to be just two parents, right? We can think about community or child, responsibilities as much more of a community effort, something that involves family, friends, support workers, community efforts. So for me, that's one interesting ways that we should be thinking more broadly of how we define family and how we can support people with disabilities have the lives that they want and have children if they so desire. Another example that I would like to give is something that I keep hearing very often throughout my field work for the last 10 years. Support workers who have been telling me that people with intellectual disabilities are often put on birth control, specifically women with intellectual disabilities, despite the fact of whether or not they're sexually active. Here's an example from Alice, a support worker who's been in the field for over 10 years. And that's when she says, Dapple shot is so common. Every girl who could potentially be sexually active, whether or not she is on the Dapple shot. Like every single woman of childbearing years who I worked with who had the potential to have sex was on Dapple shot. Again, there is an argument to be made, of course, that sometimes it might be a choice from women with disabilities to be put on birth control, and that is okay. But unfortunately, one of the things that I've been hearing very often throughout my research projects is that it's not often a choice. So women with intellectual disabilities are sometimes put on birth control without their knowledge that that is birth control, or without the full information about what that means. For example, that some forms of birth control may have side effects. So people are not sometimes given the full information about what's being put into their bodies. Some people are also coerced into making those particular decisions about whether or not to be on birth control. So again, this really raises an alarm, I think, in terms of neogenic practices. We see more and more aggressive and violent ways that we're preventing people from becoming parents potentially. This notion that people with disabilities reproduce in a way that creates bad humans, right? It creates humans that will be a burden on society. That's a very eugenics notion. When I asked Alice, the same support worker, like, do women with intellectual disabilities know that this is birth control? How much do they participate in decision making? That's when she says, I would say very little. They would say, oh, we can make your, that messy time in the month where they make it sound like very bad and all. We can make that go away. Do you like that idea? Oh, yeah, that would be easy, sure. And then the guardian can be like, yeah, I think it's a great idea, don't you? And so then it will be passively aggressively put across and manipulated into thinking that you made that decision to go on DAPO, but really it wasn't. It wasn't your decision. So again, we see that kind of misinformation or not complete information about birth control that suggests or makes it seem like people have a choice when sometimes they're coerced or pushed into particular choices. I've also seen the very extreme of sterilization. Even though 1970s, right, is in the past, we still see cases in our communities where this happens. Rose, a support worker, tells me the story of this couple, both with intellectual disabilities, where they get caught by a support worker making out. This, of course, releases a whole bunch of different procedures in the organization. And then she talks about this. She says, her family was so angry, and then they moved her out of the community, and she also had a surgical procedure. Whatever they did was to, what's the proper term for when you remove someone's sexuality, like their reproductive parts? And then I say, like, sterilization? That's when Rose answers, yes, that's it. Yeah. I remember this young lady told me about this. When she explained to me, she seemed quite okay with it. Of course she would be. The way, I don't think she understood what that meant. And takes a deep breath. Here we see another example, someone, a very extreme example, someone who is sterilized, without being fully informed of what that meant. I mean, this is something that happened in the last decade. Like, these things still happen in our communities. And I mean, we have other cases of other social groups, for example, Indigenous women in Canada here who are suing particular governments like the Saskatchewan House Authority because they're talking about being coerced into sterilization. Women who are coming out and sharing their stories of being given forms to consent to sterilization during birth. I mean, that's not the best time, right, or circumstance to ask people about for their consent to be sterilized, a decision that can have lifelong impact. So even in these days, we still have evidence of particular social groups who are pushed into sterilization, whether through with consent or without their consent. So we have this terrible history here in across Canada and in other provinces, in across Canada and even outside in other countries. Now, so this is one piece of the puzzle that I've been really seeing in my project, which is that examples of Newgenics, lots of evidence in the field on the ground that demonstrates that we haven't learned our lesson, and that we, if anything, eugenic practices, worked and operate in more covert ways, right, to still prevent people from having sexual intimate lives and having children. Now, for the second part of this presentation, I'd like to very briefly talk a little bit about my other piece of work in my research agenda, which is the intersection of intellectual disabilities and sexualities in the plural. When we look at the literature, we see over and over again that people with intellectual disabilities who are not heterosexual or cisgender often experience heteronormative and cisgender assumptions. This notion that it's just impossible that people with disabilities may not identify as heterosexual. For example, I've seen workers, support workers who said, "Oh, Johnny and Mike, they're just good friends. They're holding hands and they're always close to each other, but they're just friends." Even though I knew that they were definitely not just friends. But it's this notion, again, that just doesn't work together, that you're just disabled and that's it as an identity. I've also spoken and heard from people in the community that sometimes talking about sexualities in the plural is just going too far. It's like this idea that, okay, Alan, you're already telling us that, people with disabilities are sexual, and that's already a lot for us to process. And now you're telling us that there is sexualities, that there are multiple sexual identities and gender identities. Now that's too much. This notion of too much or going too far. And that's partially why, or what motivated me to do this work, focus on intellectual disability and the experiences of gay, lesbians, bisexual, and queer people in our communities. In the literature, we see that there is often a lack of supports and informations and about sexuality and desires, and sexual identities, gender identities. We see challenges accessing and participating in queer spaces. So I really wanted to understand, what are the experiences of people here in Alberta when it comes to living at this intersection of disability and sexualities. So far, we've been able to conduct 32 interviews with people with developmental and intellectual disabilities in different cities in Alberta. And I'd like to share with you some preliminary findings that may generate some interesting discussion. And I do know, because I am connected with particular committees here at Max Ottawa, how can we make partnerships with disability communities and with disability knowledge here and make sure that our work is making sense, right? So our findings consistently shown that most people with intellectual disabilities did not encounter any kind of information about sexual or gender identities in their sex education, both in school and through family members, which left a lot of people to kind of figure out their own identities on their own. And that can be very challenging. Some people had to use the internet to do that. Some people were lucky and they found particular communities around them. And some people simply had to learn by trial and error in the community. Some people told me about not having basic information, even about safety and being able to set boundaries with potential sexual partners in a way that put them into dangerous situations. They talked about not even understanding at the time that they were experiencing forms of abuse and being vulnerable. Not until years later, when they were able to finally get information and supports, that they were able to process those insights. They also told me about a lack of representation. They told me that they rarely see themselves represented both in queer spaces, queer campaigns, movies, and TV shows. Even when there is a disabled character in these TV shows, it's usually someone with a physical impairment, someone who's white, right? We see particular even representations of disability being reproduced over and over again. One of my participants even said, quote, "I thought that queerness is only for white people." I mean, again, this notion that representations of disability and queerness remain very limited to this day. Participants also talked about the challenges in participating in queer spaces. What they meant by that is that sometimes we think about accessibility solely in terms of ramps, right, and stairs and elevators. And of course, those are important aspects of accessibility. But what they meant by that is that they wanted queer spaces that are actually welcoming and friendly to people with disabilities. Spaces that make an effort to make it themselves more inclusive and thoughtful in terms of disability. For example, some people with disabilities can get very overly stimulated in spaces with loud music and lots of lights, throbbing lights. So they wish, for example, that there would also be quiet spaces available if they would like to take a break from that kind of stimulation. They also desire or wish that there were places where they could have more quiet opportunities to meet other queer people. So we need to be thinking about how can we make our spaces more inviting, more accessible, right, to people with disabilities, and think about inclusion and accessibility in more serious ways. In terms of community, participants have been also very clear to us in talking about how they're trying to navigate fragmented communities. They are, on one hand, participating in queer spaces that are sometimes not thinking about disability and accessibility, and sometimes they're accessing disabled communities and disabled spaces where they're not thinking about queerness. So there's clearly a disconnect here. We need to put together these two different spaces in much better ways. Even service providers. I'm currently just starting a project here in Calgary where I'm bringing together service providers in disability sector and sexuality sectors so they can speak to one another, learn from one another, and start creating communities that are at that overlap, right? So we need to do a lot better in terms of how we do this. This kind of work that better supports people with disabilities in the community. So the last thing I'll say here is that what I'm saying here, articulating here, is what has been called intimate citizenship, right? Intimate citizenship, as Plummer notes, it refers to our rights to choose what we do with our bodies, our feelings, our identities, our relationships, our genders, our eroticisms, and our representations. For people with disabilities, and especially with intellectual disabilities, these rights are often taken for granted, are often denied, often absent. And that is so significant. If we want to indeed make those agreements like United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities or World Health Organization and other policies and practices, we need to change how we do things. We need to change, we need to protect the intimate citizenship of people with disabilities. All right, I know I threw a lot of information at you, but I do hope that you also understand that even though I'm highlighting some of the challenges and barriers that people with disabilities experience in the community, because that is the most common stories that I hear in my fieldwork, I think that it's also important to acknowledge the creativity and agency of people with disabilities. We do have people with disabilities out in our communities who are creating knowledge, who are putting or challenging stereotypes that people with disabilities do not desire this, intimate relationships and sex and pleasure. So we need to learn from community members, from people with lived experiences who are providing us with tons and tons of amazing material. It can be blog posts, podcasts, book chapters, poems, art pieces. They're providing us with amazing perspectives about how we can transform sexuality. one example of how I think disability can really improve everyone's sexuality is this notion that some participants have been telling me that communication can also be very tricky for some people. Reading between the lines can be difficult for some people with intellectual disabilities. So, what they found is that it pushed them to have more open and straightforward communications with their sexual partners about what they like or don't like. Isn't that a lesson that everyone should follow, like including non-disabled people in the community? Shouldn't we all have conversations that are much more open? Shouldn't we be able to articulate in a very clear and good manner what we desire and what we desire or don't desire? So I think there are lessons also to be learned from my participants in terms of how can we challenge how we understand sex and sexuality. The last example I'll give you is one participant who was telling me, I like to tell jokes during sex, but a lot of people without disabilities find it very weird and strange. But why is it that we have the sexual script or this notion that we cannot tell jokes during sex? So again, I think some of the stories from my participants illustrate how we have a very narrow, sometimes understanding on how relationships can happen, how sex can happen. I think we all benefit when we kind of expand how we understand these things can unfold and how sexual scripts can be so much more interesting and have humor in them and have creativity and lots more communication in them. So I would like to just acknowledge that my research, participants who kindly and generously share their experiences. For a lot of research participants, this was their first time ever being able to speak about their sexuality in a non-judgmental way. And I really don't take that lightly. And we can certainly talk more about it in the Q&A if people are interested. And I'd also like to thank Megan Robbins, my research assistant here at University of Calgary, who is supporting me in this current project around intellectual disabilities and sexualities. All right, thank you so much again, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Alan. Very interesting presentation and project. And I hope we'll have the opportunity to read more about what you do. We have comments. I'm just gonna read them very quickly. Wow, very well said. Loved your presentation. Thank you, Dr. Alan Martino, for your time. And then I have another comment. Thank you for talking about this today. Thank you. I have
Thank you.
one question for you.
Mhm.
I think you covered pretty much like different aspects, so I don't really have a question about the presentation. I think it's clear, and I love that we had the opportunity to hear about participants and their experiences. My question is, I would say very simple, but not simple at the same time. So, if you had to give, as community organizations, if you had to give us three key advice for organizations like Max working in health and with a very wide audience, including people living with disabilities, what would they be? Uh,
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think there's definitely things that we can do. First of all, I think we need to educate ourselves, right? Like we need to educate ourselves about different ways of understanding disability that is not just about limitations, that is not so narrow, right? So we need to do our homework as however we identify guys who are into guys or queer people, whatever it is, we need to do the work of learning and unlearning sometimes what we encounter in the past. We need to invite people with disabilities to meaningfully engage. So it's one thing to say we welcome everyone, but it's another thing to actually reach out to self-advocacy groups, to reach out to community members and say, we really want you here. We care about your perspective, and we're willing, to first of all compensate you for your time and the teaching that you're giving us, and really acknowledge that we need to unlearn and learn some things and change the way we do things. One way, for example, is to change accessibility practices, right? acknowledging that, for example, there are multiple ways of collaborating, multiple ways of sharing information. For some people with intellectual disabilities, for example, art is the best way for them to communicate what inclusion means. What does it mean for them to experience sexuality? So we need to be thinking much more broadly about what counts as a voice, what counts as a way to participate in conversations, right? So we need to understand all those things and meaningfully invite and engage with people, if that makes sense.
Oh, yes, thank you. And it's great that there's also a focus on intellectual disabilities. Usually, when we think about communication and accessibility, we tend to focus only or more on physical disability, and we forget about intellectual disabilities in our communication as organizations. So that's great. There's a question in the chat, so I will read it for you. Did you have any advice on how to open the conversation up to service providers on how to celebrate sexuality and advocate for it?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question too. The first, I want to acknowledge that some support workers are really fantastic. Like they're really going above and beyond to support people that they work with. And I'll just share a quick example here that I loved. Someone I know, a support worker, she was telling me about a young man who really wanted to take a dick pic. I mean, dick pics now are so, even if you want it or not, it's coming your way, and it's scary. But this young man who really wanted to take one, he had a particular kind of physical impairment that didn't allow him to do it himself. So the staff member in the house actually mobilized to create this kind of machine where he could place the phone and take the photo that he wanted himself. So they did that. They gave him space to take the photos he wanted. He did, and then they just disconnected the machine they come up with, and they helped him like do whatever he wanted. I mean, that to me is such a great example. Support workers who have an open mind, who are really being person centered, right? Like they're trying to understand what he wants for his life and trying to think creatively about how to support him in doing that. Of course, that's not the reality for everyone. Some support workers feel extremely uncomfortable with the topic. And what I try to do is we need to change that. The same way that we're very comfortable talking to people about employment, education, we need to be able to have those conversations about sexuality in the same non-judgmental way. That involves us learning, but also advocating within our organizations to have those conversations and resources. We need to push administrators into providing us with the training we need, right? Having self-advocacy groups, for example. How can self-advocates have a voice in terms of how we educate staff, how we want our policies and as organizations to look like? So for me, it's sometimes I encounter support workers who are having a hard time start those conversations in their organizations, and I just tell them, use me. You can say there's a great speaker who can come and talk to us about his work, and that can be a conversation starter, right? And I'm not afraid of talking about this, and it can be less uncomfortable, right? Count on allies. We have self-advocates in the community who can provide amazing resource. We have families who can be great allies in terms of helping us convince other families that this is important to talk about, right? Count on allies that we have in the community. And finally, like it's really about intimate citizenship at the end of the day, right? Like it's about people's rights. And I think that language of rights, it's extremely important when we're talking about this. It's not just about so-and-so's desire for intimate relationship, but it's a right that is actually recognized in policies on a national level, international level, and we need to protect those, right? Like that's our job, just like we protect people's rights in other parts of their lives.
Oh, thank you. Um, and thank you for talking about this intimate citizenship concept. This is the first time I hear about it, actually. Thank you, and thank you, Jillian, for your question. I see no other questions. So I will just say thank you so much, Dr. Martino, for presenting today. And I will stop live.
Thanks for having me.